Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped the control stick tighter as her F-16 Fighting Falcon cut through the morning sky over the disputed territory. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the rugged mountains below. Her mission was clear: provide close air support for ground troops who had been pinned down by enemy forces for the past 18 hours. The radio crackled with urgent voices from the forward air controller on the ground. Viper 1-2, we have multiple hostile positions approximately 2 clicks north of our location. Heavy machine gun nests and possible anti-aircraft positions. Our boys are taking heavy fire and need immediate assistance. Sarah adjusted her helmet and checked her instruments. Everything appeared normal. The heads-up display showed green across the board, and her radar system was painting a clear picture of the terrain ahead. She had flown dozens of similar missions over the past 6 months, but something about this morning felt different. The tension in the ground controller's voice suggested this wasn't going to be a routine support mission. As she approached the target area, Sarah began her initial reconnaissance pass. The landscape below was a maze of rocky outcroppings and dense vegetation. Perfect terrain for enemy forces to hide and launch ambush attacks. Through her canopy, she could see small puffs of smoke rising from various positions, indicating active firefights between the opposing forces. Her radar screen suddenly flickered. Sarah tapped the display with her gloved finger, assuming it was just a momentary glitch. The system had been acting up slightly during pre-flight checks, but the maintenance crew had assured her it was within acceptable parameters. She made a mental note to keep an eye on it as she continued her approach. The ground controller's voice came through her headset again, more urgent this time. Viper 1-2, we're marking our position with purple smoke. Enemy positions are approximately 300 meters to our north and northeast. We need you to take out those machine gun nests before we can advance. Sarah banked left to get a better view of the battlefield. Below, she could see the purple smoke marking friendly positions and the muzzle flashes from enemy weapons. The situation was exactly as described. Her fellow soldiers were trapped in a valley with limited cover, while enemy forces held the high ground on multiple ridges. She began setting up her attack run, calling up the targeting system on her multifunction displays. This was where her training and experience would prove invaluable. The F-16 was equipped with precision-guided munitions that could eliminate enemy positions with minimal risk to friendly forces, but only if the targeting systems functioned properly. Sarah prepared to engage the first target. Her radar screen flickered again, this time staying black for several seconds before slowly coming back online. A cold knot formed in her stomach. Equipment failures at altitude were every pilot's nightmare, especially during combat operations where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death for the troops on the ground. She tried to push the worry aside and focus on the mission. The ground forces were counting on her, and she had trained for years to handle exactly this type of situation. Her weapons systems were still functioning, and she had visual contact with the target area. Even if the radar continued to act up, she could still provide effective support using her other instruments and her own eyes. The enemy positions were becoming clearer as she descended to a lower altitude. She could make out the sandbagged machine gun nests and what appeared to be a mortar position, tucked between 2 large boulders. These were exactly the types of targets her precision weapons were designed to eliminate. Sarah lined up for her first attack run, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with combat flying. Years of training had prepared her for this moment, but she knew that no amount of simulation could truly replicate the pressure of real combat with lives hanging in the balance. Sarah initiated her first bombing run, diving toward the primary target at a steep angle. The machine gun nest was clearly visible now, positioned on a rocky ledge overlooking the valley where friendly forces were pinned down. She activated her targeting pod and began the lock-on sequence, but her radar screen chose that exact moment to fail completely. The display went black with a sharp electronic whine that made her stomach drop. Without the radar system, her precision targeting capabilities were severely compromised. The sophisticated computer systems that normally calculated wind speed, target distance, and optimal release points were no longer available to her. Negative. Radar contact, she muttered to herself, running through emergency procedures in her mind. The radar failure meant she would have to rely entirely on visual targeting and manual calculations. It was possible, but infinitely more dangerous and less accurate. The ground controller's voice cut through her thoughts. Viper 1-2, what's your status? We're still taking heavy fire down here. Ground control, this is Viper 1-2. I have a radar malfunction, but am still mission capable. Beginning manual targeting procedures. Sarah tried to keep her voice steady, but she knew the implications of her equipment failure. Manual targeting meant getting closer to enemy positions and staying in their engagement envelope longer, increasing her own risk significantly. She pulled out of her dive and began a wide circle around the target area, studying the enemy positions, with her naked eye and the limited optical system still functioning. The morning sun was now higher in the sky, creating both advantages and disadvantages. Better visibility meant she could see targets more clearly, but it also meant the enemy could spot her aircraft more easily. Through her canopy, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions. The enemy had clearly prepared this ambush, well, with overlapping fields of fire and good concealment. Taking out these positions with manual targeting would require multiple passes, each one exposing her to ground fire. She began her mental calculations, estimating distance, windage, and approach angles the way pilots had done for decades before computer-assisted targeting became standard. Her flight instructor's voice echoed in her memory. Technology fails, but good eyeball targeting and pilot instinct never let you down. Sarah selected her first target, the machine gun nest that appeared to be causing the most trouble for the ground forces. She would use a low-angle approach, coming in fast and pulling up sharply after weapon release. The technique was risky but would minimize her exposure time to enemy fire. As she positioned for the attack run, anti-aircraft fire suddenly erupted from positions she hadn't spotted before. Bright orange tracers streaked past her canopy, some passing uncomfortably close to her aircraft. The enemy had been waiting for her to commit to an attack before revealing their air defense positions. "Taking fire! Taking fire!" Sarah called out as she jinked hard left to avoid the stream of bullets. Her aircraft shuddered as she pulled maximum G-forces, the pressure suit inflating to keep blood flowing to her brain. The enemy gunners were good, tracking her movement and leading their shots effectively. She climbed rapidly to get out of range of the small arms fire, her mind racing through tactical options. The situation had become significantly more complicated. Not only did she have to deal with the radar failure, but now she faced active air defenses that hadn't shown themselves during her initial reconnaissance. The ground controller's voice crackled through the radio again, tinged with desperation. "Viper 1-2, our situation is becoming critical. We have wounded personnel and are running low on ammunition. Can you suppress those positions?" Sarah looked down at the battlefield below, where she could see friendly forces huddled behind minimal cover, while enemy fire continued to pour down from the ridgelines. She thought about the soldiers on the ground, possibly some she had shared meals with back at base. They were counting on her to neutralize the threat, radar or no radar. She made her decision. Manual targeting would have to be enough. She had trained for this scenario, though she had hoped never to use those skills in actual combat. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began her descent toward the target area once more, this time relying entirely on her eyes, her experience, and her determination. To save the lives of the soldiers below, Sarah descended toward her target, manually calculating the attack parameters that her radar system would normally handle automatically. She estimated the target distance at approximately 800 meters with a crosswind from the northeast, at roughly 15 knots. These calculations had to be perfect, as she would only get one chance before the enemy gunners adjusted their aim. The machine gun nest came into clear view through her heads-up display. Sarah could actually see the enemy soldiers manning the weapon, their camouflage uniforms blending with the rocky terrain. She lined up her approach, using the aircraft's gun sight and her own spatial awareness to estimate the proper lead angle for her bombing run. At exactly the right moment, she released her first precision-guided munition and immediately pulled into a sharp climbing turn to avoid the inevitable ground fire. Even without radar guidance, the weapon's internal systems would guide it to the target area, though with significantly less precision than normal operations would allow. The explosion echoed across the valley as her bomb found its mark, sending up a massive cloud of dust and debris. Sarah banked around to assess the damage and was relieved to see that the machine gun position had been eliminated. The manual targeting had worked, though the margin for error had been uncomfortably small. "Good. Hit Viper 1-2," came the excited voice of the ground controller. "That's one down. But we still have multiple positions engaging us from the northeast ridge." Sarah spotted the next target, another fortified position that appeared to house a mortar crew. This target would be more challenging, because mortars could be moved quickly, and the crew had probably observed her attack on the first position. They would be ready for her this time. As she set up for the second attack run, more anti-aircraft fire erupted from concealed positions. The tracers formed, deadly streams of light across her flight path, forcing her to take evasive action. Without her radar system to warn her of threats, she was flying blind into what had become a gauntlet of enemy fire. One tracer round passed so close to her canopy that she could see the bright core of the projectile as it flashed by. Her heart pounded as she realized how close she had come to being shot down. The enemy gunners were not only well-positioned, but also experienced and disciplined fighters. Sarah climbed back to altitude to reassess the situation. Looking down at the battlefield, she could count at least 5 separate enemy positions that posed threats to both the ground forces and her own aircraft. Taking them all out with manual targeting would require multiple attack runs, each one more dangerous than the last as the enemy adjusted their tactics. The radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the ground. "Viper 1-2, we have casualties down here. At least 3 wounded, possibly more. We need immediate suppression of those positions on the northeast ridge so our medic can reach the wounded." The desperation in the ground controller's voice was unmistakable. Sarah knew that every minute of delay could mean the difference between life and death for the wounded soldiers. She had to act quickly, even if it meant taking greater risks than she would normally accept. She decided to try a different approach for her next attack. Instead of the high-angle diving attack she had used before, she would attempt a low-level run, coming in fast and low to minimize the time enemy gunners had to track her aircraft. It was more dangerous, but it might allow her to take out multiple positions in a single pass. Sarah pushed her aircraft into a steep dive, building up speed for the low-level attack run. The terrain rushed up toward her as she descended below the ridgeline, using the mountains themselves as cover from some of the enemy positions. Her airspeed indicator climbed past 400 knots as she prepared for what would be the most challenging attack of her career. The rocky terrain flashed beneath her aircraft as she skimmed just above the treetops, heading directly toward the cluster of enemy positions. She could see soldiers scrambling for cover as her F-16 roared overhead, the sound of her engines echoing off the mountain walls. This was her chance to eliminate multiple targets before they could effectively return fire. Sarah screamed across the valley floor at treetop level, her F-16 moving so fast that enemy gunners barely had time to track her movement. She lined up on the mortar position, using pure visual targeting, her years of training taking over as she made split-second calculations for weapon release. At precisely the right moment, she released her second bomb and immediately pulled into a violent climbing turn. The G-forces pressed her deep into her seat as she fought to maintain consciousness. Behind her, the explosion lit up the mountainside, and through her rear-view mirror, she saw debris and smoke marking another successful hit. But her celebration was cut short as anti-aircraft fire erupted from a position she hadn't seen before. Bright tracers streaked past her aircraft, and she heard the terrifying sound of bullets striking her fuselage. Warning lights began flashing on her instrument panel as multiple systems reported damage. "Aircraft hit. Aircraft hit," Sarah called out as she struggled to maintain control. The stick felt sluggish in her hands, and she could see hydraulic fluid streaming from somewhere beneath her aircraft. Her primary flight controls were compromised, making every maneuver a battle against her own plane. Despite the damage, Sarah managed to climb to a safer altitude while she assessed the extent of her injuries. The aircraft was still flying, but several critical systems were either damaged or completely offline. Most concerning was the hydraulic system failure, which would make landing extremely difficult even if she could return to base. The ground controller's voice came through her headset, filled with concern. "Viper 1-2, what's your status? We saw you take hits on that last pass." I'm still airborne but have significant aircraft damage, Sarah responded, fighting to keep her voice steady. Hydraulic system is compromised and I'm showing multiple warning lights, but I can still fight if you need me to. Looking down at the battlefield, Sarah could see that her 2 successful attacks had significantly reduced enemy fire on the friendly positions. The soldiers on the ground were beginning to move, using the lull in enemy fire to reach their wounded comrades and establish better defensive positions. However, at least 3 enemy positions remained active, including what appeared to be a command post that was coordinating the enemy's defensive efforts. If she could eliminate that position, it might break the enemy's ability to maintain their coordinated fire and allow the ground forces to advance. Sarah knew she was facing a critical decision. Her aircraft was damaged and becoming increasingly difficult to control. The smart tactical decision would be to return to base immediately before her condition worsened. But the ground forces were still in danger, and she might be their only chance for survival. She thought about her training, her oath as an officer, and the soldiers who were counting on her support. The enemy command post was located in a particularly well-defended position, surrounded by anti-aircraft guns and positioned on high ground that would require a dangerous approach. As she circled the battlefield, Sarah noticed something that might give her an advantage. The morning sun was now positioned in such a way that she could approach the command post from the east, using the sun's glare to mask her approach until the last possible moment. It would be a risky maneuver, especially with her damaged aircraft, but it might be her best chance to eliminate the target. Her damaged hydraulic system meant that she would have only one chance at this attack. If she missed, or if her aircraft sustained further damage, she might not be able to maintain controlled flight long enough to reach base. The stakes had never been higher. Sarah took a deep breath and began her approach toward the enemy command post. She would rely entirely on manual targeting, damaged flight controls, and her determination to complete the mission. The soldiers on the ground deserved nothing less than her absolute best effort, regardless of the personal risk. As she lined up for what might be her final attack run, enemy fire began to erupt from multiple positions. The command post defenders had spotted her approach and were coordinating their fire to create an almost impenetrable wall of tracers across her flight path. Sarah dove toward the enemy command post through a wall of anti-aircraft fire that seemed impossible to survive. Tracers streaked past her canopy in every direction, creating a deadly light show against the morning sky. Her damaged aircraft shuddered and groaned as she pushed it beyond its compromised limits, fighting against failed systems and battle damage. The enemy gunners had learned from her previous attacks and were now firing in coordinated patterns, creating overlapping fields of fire that left no safe corridor for her approach. Sarah had to constantly adjust her flight path, jinking left and right, while still maintaining her attack heading toward the command post. Her damaged hydraulic system made every control input a struggle. What should have been smooth, precise movements became jerky, unpredictable responses that threatened to send her aircraft into an unrecoverable spin. Sweat poured down her face inside her helmet as she fought to maintain control while simultaneously calculating her attack parameters. The command post was clearly visible now, a fortified position built into the rocky mountainside with communication equipment and what appeared to be senior enemy officers directing the battle. Eliminating this target would disrupt the enemy's coordination and give the ground forces their best chance to break out of the trap. Sarah lined up her final bombing run using nothing but her eyes and instincts. Without radar guidance, she had to estimate distance, wind drift, and target movement, all while under intense fire from multiple positions. Her aircraft shook as several more bullets found their mark, and new warning lights began flashing on her instrument panel. At the critical moment, she released her last precision-guided munition and immediately pulled into the steepest climb her damaged aircraft could manage. The G-forces were enormous, threatening to tear her already weakened airframe apart. She could hear metal creaking and hydraulic systems failing as her F-16 struggled to respond to her desperate inputs. Behind her, the explosion was massive, much larger than her previous attacks. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition and fuel stored at the command post detonated in a chain reaction. The entire mountainside seemed to shake from the blast, sending up a mushroom cloud of smoke and debris that was visible for miles. Outstanding hit, Viper 1-2, came the excited voice of the ground controller. "The command post is completely destroyed. Enemy fire is breaking up all across the valley. You've given us the break we needed." But Sarah's celebration was short-lived as her aircraft's condition continued to deteriorate. The final attack run had pushed her damaged systems beyond their limits, and she was now dealing with multiple critical failures. Her hydraulic pressure was dropping rapidly. Several electrical systems had failed completely, and she could smell smoke in the cockpit. Most alarming was her fuel situation. The bullet holes in her aircraft had apparently damaged fuel lines, and she was losing aviation fuel at an alarming rate. A quick calculation showed that she might not have enough fuel remaining to reach her home base, especially if she encountered any headwinds or had to take evasive action. Sarah began climbing to altitude while she assessed her options. She could attempt to reach the main airbase, but that was over 200 miles away across mountainous terrain. Alternatively, there was a smaller forward operating base much closer, but it had a shorter runway and limited emergency equipment. The radio crackled with a transmission from flight operations back at her home base. "Viper 1-2, we're tracking your position and showing you as a possible emergency aircraft. What is your current status and intentions?" Sarah looked at her fuel gauge, which was dropping faster than it should even with her reduced throttle settings. She was definitely losing fuel faster than normal consumption would account for. The decision was becoming clear. She would have to attempt a landing at the forward operating base or risk running out of fuel completely. "Base operations Viper 1-2 declaring an emergency. I have battle damage including hydraulic failure and fuel leak. I'm diverting to forward operating base Charlie for an emergency landing." Her voice remained calm and professional despite the gravity of her situation. As she changed course toward the nearer base, Sarah began running through emergency landing procedures in her mind. Landing an F-16 with failed hydraulics was one of the most challenging emergencies a pilot could face, requiring precise timing and nerves of steel. Sarah approached the forward operating base with her damaged F-16 barely responding to control inputs. The hydraulic failure meant she had to use manual reversion mode for flight controls, making every adjustment a physical struggle against the aircraft's natural stability. Her fuel gauge showed critically low levels with warning lights indicating she had perhaps 10 minutes of flight time remaining. The air traffic controller at the forward base had been alerted to her emergency and cleared all other traffic from the airspace. Fire trucks and ambulances were positioned along the runway, their crews ready for what could be a catastrophic crash landing. Sarah could see them through her canopy as she lined up for her final approach. Without working hydraulics, her landing gear deployment was manual and uncertain. She activated the emergency gear extension system and waited anxiously as the wheels slowly lowered into position. 2 green lights indicated that her main gear was down and locked, but the nose gear light remained amber, suggesting it might not be fully secured. "Tower Viper 1-2 on final approach. I show 2 main gear down and locked, but nose gear indication is uncertain. Be advised I may have a nose gear collapse on landing." Sarah's voice remained steady despite knowing that a nose gear collapse at high speed could result in her aircraft cartwheeling down the runway. The runway appeared before her, looking impossibly narrow and short after the events of the morning. Her approach speed was higher than normal because of her hydraulic failure, and she knew she would need every foot of available runway to stop safely. The emergency arresting cables had been raised to help slow her aircraft if needed. Sarah fought to maintain proper glide path as her damaged flight controls tried to pull the aircraft in different directions. She could feel vibrations through the airframe that suggested structural damage beyond what she had initially realized. Her F-16 was literally falling apart around her as she attempted this critical landing. The runway threshold rushed up to meet her as she crossed over the approach lights. Sarah pulled back slightly on the stick to flare for landing, but the damaged hydraulics made the response sluggish and unpredictable. She touched down harder than she would have liked, bouncing slightly before settling onto the runway surface. Her worst fears were realized as the nose gear immediately collapsed, sending sparks flying as the aircraft's nose scraped along the concrete. The F-16 veered slightly to the left, and Sarah fought to maintain directional control using her rudder pedals and wheel brakes. The emergency arresting cable caught her tail hook, helping to slow the aircraft before it could run off the runway. Fire. Trucks immediately surrounded her aircraft as it came to a stop, foam spraying across the hot engine and damaged airframe to prevent any fuel fires. Sarah quickly shut down her engine and began the emergency egress procedures, popping her canopy and preparing to exit the cockpit as soon as the aircraft was deemed safe. Emergency personnel helped her climb down from the damaged aircraft, checking her for injuries even as she insisted she was unharmed. As she stood on the runway looking at her F-16, Sarah was amazed that the aircraft had held together long enough to complete the mission and return to base. Bullet holes were visible throughout the fuselage, hydraulic fluid covered the ground beneath the aircraft, and the collapsed nose gear gave the fighter a defeated appearance. Her radio crackled with a transmission from the ground forces she had been supporting earlier that morning. Viper 1-2, this is ground control. Thanks to your actions today, we were able to evacuate all wounded personnel and establish secure positions. Your courage under fire saved lives today. Later that evening, as Sarah sat in the debriefing room filling out after-action reports, she reflected on the morning's events. The radar failure had forced her to rely on skills and techniques that many modern pilots never had to use in actual combat. Manual targeting, visual bombing runs, and pure pilot instinct had proved that technology, while valuable, could never completely replace human skill and determination. The mission had been successful. All enemy positions had been neutralized. The ground forces had achieved their objectives and, most importantly, no friendly personnel had been lost. Her damaged F-16 would require extensive repairs before it could fly again, but aircraft could be replaced. The lives of the soldiers she had protected could not. As she walked back to her quarters that night, Sarah knew that she had experienced something that would stay with her for the rest of her career. She had proven to herself and others that when technology fails, a well-trained pilot with courage and determination can still accomplish the mission and bring everyone home safely.